Gardner, Cody Gardner here. I just wanted to share a Bible verse with y'all. It's a passage of scripture that has really spoken to me in my life, and the Lord's given me revelation on it. We all have things in our life that we seem to struggle to overcome, and sometimes we get in these cycles where we overcome it and we think, if I can just get through a week, then I'll be good. If I can just go a month without doing this particular thing, then I'll be good. Paul talks about a passage in scripture and it really speaks to me, and it's in 2 Corinthians 12, and we're going to start in verse 7. I want to read this passage to you because there's a lot of meat in this passage. And I am reading from the Amplified, but it says this. Paul says this. He says, "And to keep me from being puffed up and too much elated by the exceeding greatness of these revelations, there was given me a thorn or a splinter in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to rack and buffet and harass me, to keep me from being excessively exalted." So right before Paul writes this in one of his letters, he's talking to a church, and he's kind of sending a rebuking letter to the church because they're boasting in the wrong things. And Paul, before this, he says, if anyone has a right to boast, I could boast in all these revelations that the Lord has given me and all the things he showed me, the visions and the prophecies and all the deep-seated revelations. But Paul, he says, there's a messenger of Satan sent to buffet him. If you hear something rattling around, I apologize. That's my dog. But in verse 8, it says, 3 times I called upon the Lord and besought him about this. Sought him about this and begged that it might depart from me. But he said to me, my grace, my favor, and my loving kindness and mercy is enough for you. It's sufficient against any danger and enables you to bear the trouble manfully. For my strength and my powers are made perfect, fulfilled and completed, and show themselves most effective in your weakness. So Paul goes on to say, he says, therefore I will all the more gladly glory in my weakness and infirmities, that the strength and power of Christ the Messiah may rest or pitch its tent over and dwell upon me. So for the sake of Christ I am well pleased and take pleasure in infirmities, insults, hardships, persecutions, perplexities, and distresses. For when I am weak in human strength, then am I truly strong in divine strength. So this is Paul, and he had a rough go when he started. He persecuted the church. He killed Christians, doing it in the name of Christianity, thinking he was doing what was right. Now that goes to prove the fact that even good intentions sometimes can be the wrong thing. Paul's good intentions conflicted with God's will until Paul had his encounter on the road to Emmaus, and God knocked him down, blinded him with a light, and said to him, Saul, Saul, because his name was Saul at this time, why are you persecuting me? And Paul said, who are you, Lord? In other words, Paul knew that there was someone way greater than him that was speaking to him, and he identified and named him as Lord, as your sovereign. You're greater than I am. So Paul does really good. He has the education. He has all the education of a Pharisee or a Sadducee. He has all of this religious background. And Paul could be real prideful in these things. He could be real prideful in how much the Lord had done in his life, how much he could teach, and how he understood the word and could teach it to where it was understood. And he could boast about all of the churches that he had started with God's help, but he didn't. But to help him not get to a point where pride took over and destroyed his walk, the Lord allowed Satan to buffet him with whatever that thorn in the flesh may have been. We don't know. It doesn't tell us specifically. But we know that there was something that tormented Paul at times, and it kept him from being prideful. So in my life, when I think about it, and I have another video on here of my testimony, I have a thorn in my flesh, and everyone could have a thorn in their flesh and it be different. For instance, My thorn in my flesh is something that I am encountering every once in a while. It's something that I've overcome, but it's something I encounter again every once in a while. And I have to go to God. I have to rely on God. I have to trust that He'll get me through it. I have to trust that His grace covered my previous sins, my previous lifestyles. And I have to believe that God's grace is sufficient for me. It's sufficient to get me through the trial, and it was sufficient to cover the things that I'd done in the past that I know were wrong. And Paul had to do that. He had to know that God's grace was sufficient. God's grace covered all things. See, here's the awesome thing about God is that it doesn't matter what I've done. It doesn't matter how I did it. I can go to God and I can be forgiven for my sins. I can believe and put my trust in Jesus Christ. I can believe that He died on that cross and shed the blood that I could be saved. And I can run to Jesus. And Jesus wipes my slate clean. It says in Psalms 139, there's a verse that says, He knew me before I was born. All the days of my life were written down in this book. God already knew everything I was going to do, every word I would say, every thought I would think. And He factored that into His will for my life. And because of that, I got off the track a little bit. I wouldn't go back and change any of the things I've gone through because God is going to use it for His glory in a powerful way. But you too might have a thorn in your flesh. You might think, well, this is something that I should have already overcome. It should be out of my life. I shouldn't be struggling with this anymore. Maybe that is there. There's a remnant left to keep your focus on God, to keep you in an understanding that you need Him to push on. You need Him in your life. You can't do it independently. Because if I try to overcome things in my life independently, I fall. But me having a thorn in my flesh, just like Paul having a thorn in his flesh, it kept him dependent on God the Father, which is a very powerful thing. It's a very unique thing. We have to be dependent on God if we want to be in God's will. We have to depend on Him for our breath. We have to depend on Him to show us which way to go. We have to depend on Him for each step we take because God doesn't want to lead us the wrong way. He wants to lead us into the pastures that are green. He wants to lead us beside the still waters. Now, that's not to say that sometimes we won't go by the rough waters. We all have trials and we all have temptations. But it's what you do in those times, it's who you run to that makes the difference. You can run to what you've always known and live independently of God, or you can run to God and overcome victoriously in God.